by our wonderful co-chair of the State Fair Park and Ride. We are seeking 2 more volunteers for the late night shift on Labor Day. So if you would like to volunteer someone, this is your opportunity to consider that or to volunteer yourself. Thank you. Grace and peace to you from God, our Creator, and our Lord Jesus Christ.
Amen. I
admit freely, it's been a while since I've been up here, so I'm a little intimidated by all of you, and a little concerned. So I ask for just a little bit of grace. Rick, would you be willing to go to the next slide? One of my favorite things of being a pastor here at Gustavus is when I enter the pulpit in our sanctuary and I see this sign, "We would see Jesus." I don't know which of our pastors or which congregation member put this plaque in the pulpit in this sanctuary, but it is a gift of grace that reminds me that our point of being together in our ministry, that the point of any message, the point of everything that we do together as God's people is so that we would see Jesus. As we look at today's gospel story, this story about invitation, being invited and being inviting, we are reminded that it is so we would see Jesus. In this time in which there are many great meal stories going on, it's the state fair after all. I'm sure you have been well fed this last week if you have gone to the fair. These stories around food are central to our Christian community, from Jesus' time on to today. The meal itself is a metaphor for God's kingdom. A metaphor that reminds us that God's kingdom is one in which God invites all and says, "My table is set. All are welcome. Here is the feast." And God calls us to extend that grace, that generosity, that spirit of inclusion to one and all. When I was reading the gospel this last week, I started thinking about these values we place around meals. In my family growing up, daily suppers were important. Regardless of our extracurriculars, whether it be soccer or Girl Scouts or confirmation, my parents had an expectation that we would sit together at our family table. It meant sometimes we would eat at 4:30, sometimes at 9 o'clock, but we would gather together as a family. Over our mashed potatoes and pork chops and green beans, we would sit and share conversation about work and school. When we would go over to other people's houses, my parents imparted their understanding of their family values through etiquette and manners. When we would go to my Aunt Elsie's house, who was a great state fair aficionado, she would set the most beautiful table. Imagine how Gustavus looks at times with the linens everywhere and the silverware set and the cloth napkins out. That was my Aunt Elsie's house every single time. And when we sit down, we would begin our time with prayer. And then conversation would ensue and we would serve one another. And we would have time to say, "How was your day?" and to listen. I imagine in your own family you have rules and manners and etiquette that are grounded around meals. What are the values that you have for those meals? What values were you taught in your own childhood, and what family traditions have you continued around meal fellowship? In my own family, one of them was that I always had to say a kind word about whatever was served to me, which as a child you can imagine was quite a struggle. I mentioned my great aunt Elsie, who was this prim and proper woman. She always wore dresses below the knee, of course, because she was raised in the 40s. And she would have high heels on, even when we played outside in the grass. And she would set the table with beautiful linens, and she'd have all of the courses, a starter, a main dish, and dessert. And I remember once at her dinner table, she served lemon bars, her signature dish, her signature bar. And I remember as I took a bite, and it was the most sour thing I had ever eaten in my whole life. My whole face began to become red, and my mouth was watering. And my Aunt Elsie turned to me with a gracious smile and said, "Are they the way you like them?" And grabbing for a glass of water and gulping it down, I said, "I love them, Aunt Elsie. I just love them." And so as I tried to take down and finish that bar, she, in her hospitality, offered me a plate of more lemon bars. And knowing that the good manners instilled in me were to take a second, I took a second. And I said, "Thank you so much, Aunt Elsie, for knowing exactly what I like to eat." Because in my family, my mom wanted me to just be gracious and to give thanks for what was offered. Now, if you know me, I still don't like to eat lemon bars to this day, but I will. So know that they're offered, I will take them. I appreciate your honesty, Elijah. But I realized as an adult that while there were a lot of manners around the table, and you may have them yourself, my parents were trying to teach me a deeper value. The deeper value was one of invitation, one about God and what it means to be a part of God's table. That the nature of God's being, the nature of God's church, God's people, is to be one of invitation in which God invites us and calls us to extend God's grace and love through a spirit of being inviting to others. You see, the real gift of sitting with my Aunt Elsie wasn't her lemon bars or any of the treats she would make. It was the gift of relationship. It was the opportunity to know one another authentically, to have her share stories of my mother and her brother, who was my grandfather, when they were little, to have her give me sage advice, to share of herself, and to inquire after a child's dreams and hopes and days. Growing up, I always knew she valued me for who I was in that moment and who God was creating me to be. The gift of God's table is one of relationship. We see that when we gather for Open Table, our Wednesday weekly dinners. Since I have returned this week, I have heard so many good things about Open Table. How during the week of Vacation Bible School, over 150 people were here for supper together. How people are engaged in the setting up of the table, the preparation of the food, the gathering one-on-one with people at mealtime, and the cleaning. All aspects of the meal that provide opportunities for relationship and to remember that we are invited and we are to be invited. In the Gospel of Luke, the story that we read today about Jesus said yes to the invitation from the leader of the Pharisee to go to his house for supper. This is the third dinner invitation in the Gospel of Luke that Jesus accepts from someone who is a Pharisee. Someone within his own broader faith community whom he has things in relationship in common with, but also differences. Even though he and the Pharisees were in dispute and at times maybe even hostile towards one another, Jesus said, yes, I will be at your table. I will be a guest. And Jesus said, yes, I believe that this table should be open to all. In the story we read, he subverts the system in the Greco-Roman society. He subverts it to say the way that this system exists is not God's way. In Greco-Roman society, you gain prestige and honor through different vocational employment opportunities, through your wealth, through who your parents were, whether or not you had Roman citizenship, whether or not you followed a certain faith or were a certain ethnicity. Doesn't sound too far off from today in our modern society, does it? Social standing mattered, just like it somewhat matters today in America. But Jesus says that's the way the world sees people. That's not the way God sees people. You see, God sees everyone having a place at the table. And that in particular, God's people invite those who are seen as the least in social standing. He says the lame, the blind, the crippled, and the poor. God's kingdom is one that is radically inclusive, in which the invitation is open for all. When we gather for Holy Communion, we gather to have a foretaste of God's kingdom. We remember that all are welcome, that God sets the table, and that Jesus is guest and host. When we gather on Wednesday nights for open table, we have a foretaste of God's kingdom here on earth. God's kingdom is just a term, a Christian theological term that says God's dream of how God's world should be, in which people are valued for who they are, for being made in the holy image of God, rather for the way social standing in our modern society may define them. When we are invited and inviting, we do so that we would see Jesus. Every time we invite in relationship with humility and grace and generosity and warmth our neighbor, stranger, foe, someone who is different than us, we see and acknowledge Jesus in them. And maybe, just maybe, they will see Jesus in us too. Amen.
Amen.